on youth organizing. And this webinar is to share about the request for proposals that we've just put out for our new project, Powerful Transformations, strengthening, evaluating, and funding the impact of youth organizing on individual young people. This is a project, I'll just say, that we've been talking about at FCYO for a long time. A big part of our mission is to figure out how to get more resources to the important work that youth organizing groups are doing. And since FCYO was started in 2000, a big part of our work has been about how do we reach youth development and other funders who really care about young people in particular. And we've been talking for a long time about how to do that and how do we help youth organizing groups do that directly, not through us at FCYO. And so we're really excited to be launching this project to try to move that work forward, and excited to see so many of you on. Just a couple of tech notes again. All the participants will be muted, but you can use the chat feature to introduce yourself and to interact with each other. Just make sure to chat to everyone. And again, for those who just arrived, please use the chat to introduce yourself and tell us your name and where you're from, anything about issues that you're working on right now. If you have questions, and you can put questions in throughout, you'll notice there's a Q&A tab down at the bottom. So the best way to ask questions, to make sure that we don't get them lost in the chat, is to click on the Q&A tab and put your questions in there. And then the panelists will be able to directly respond to the questions in the Q&A. So, and feel free, we'll have a bunch of time for Q&A at the end, but feel free, as your questions come up, go ahead and put them in the Q&A. So for example, someone just put it in the Q&A, how long will this webinar be? This will be a 1-hour webinar. See, if you put your questions in, we will answer them. So I think that's a little bit about the tech notes. What we really wanted to do on this webinar is to give you all a basic overview about the Powerful Transformations project, how it will work, what your groups will get out of it, what you won't get out of it, and to be and what our criteria is, what we're looking for. So we'll go through a bunch of that information, and I will introduce you to the fabulous team that will be doing the coaching and technical assistance and capacity building work for this initiative, and give them a chance to introduce themselves. And then we'll take any questions and answers that you all have. Next slide. So this project is part of the capacity building projects that FCYO has offered over the last couple of years. So for each of the last couple of years, we've done a project. The basic goal was to work with a small cohort of 8 to 10 groups to really help them build capacity around a particular area, to offer coaching, but also peer learning between the groups, and then to take lessons from that can be shared with the field as a whole, to develop some lessons and toolkits and things like that. So the last 2 years, the initiatives that we've done have been around financial management and around digital organizing. And you can find webinars and toolkits that were developed from those on our website. Next slide. So a little bit of background on this initiative in particular. So as many of you know, so I started out in youth organizing as the director of the Philadelphia Student Union. Started doing that work when I was about 19 years old. And when I started out in youth organizing, a lot of us weren't really that into offering services and supports to young people. We were sort of like, we're the organizers. What we do is radical. Those service people are doing something else. That's not what we do. Right? But more and more folks have realized over the last several years that if we really want to support the leadership of young people, that we need to support their holistic needs, not just their ability to speak publicly or to analyze capitalism or to put out a good press release, but that young people have academic, social, and emotional healing from the effects of oppression and trauma. That if we're serious about supporting young people's needs, to incorporate those things into organizing as well. And a lot of your organizations have gotten very good at this over the last several years. And we found that that work not only supports those young people, but it makes the organizing work stronger. When youth leaders are supported as whole people, it strengthens the organizing work. And so that there has started to be some good research on this. And I put a few links in here, and I'll drop them in the chat too so that they're clickable. But there have been a number of really useful links and research. A couple of tools that FCYO has developed. Our Roots Initiative Toolkit, which you can see a link to there, from many years ago, has a fabulous toolkit for youth organizing groups that want to incorporate more youth development supports into their work. And there's some great tools to do that. There's also our Leadership Pipeline Toolkit that came out of our Leadership Pipeline Grant Making Initiative, which is tools for supporting youth leaders as they get older, and how do we support them as they transition out of being young people. Also on there, we did a webinar last year that was one of our best attended webinars on healing, support, and transformation, how youth organizing groups are offering these kinds of supports to their members. Some fabulous groups shared how they're doing that work, so you can check out that webinar if you're interested on this. And lastly, on this point, I'll say that all of this work that youth organizing groups are doing, that there's starting to be more data that shows that it's highly effective, that it has a big impact on the young people, and especially on young people from some of the most marginalized communities that aren't reached by other kinds of youth development programs. So we have a link there to our OPS 11 that was some great research from a few years ago that shows the data on the impact of youth organizing on individual young people. And there's lots of other good data that's coming out like that these days. Just wanted to share some of those resources so that folks have access. And I will now put them in the chat so that they will be clickable links as well. Will, can we go next slide, please? So youth organizing groups are doing all of this fabulous work, but reaching these youth development funders has often been difficult. Some groups have been really successful, at reaching youth development funders, and have found youth development funders that would fund their specific youth activities. And then that has allowed them to focus other resources on their organizing activities, and they've been able to really become very strong because of doing that. However, for a lot of groups, it's been very difficult to reach youth development funders. It seems like youth development funders should be natural funders that would be interested in supporting youth organizing, but there have been a lot of barriers. On one hand, we found that youth organizing groups often haven't had the language that youth development funders want to hear, and often haven't had the kind of data. So while young people are benefiting in tremendous ways from participating in youth organizing, many youth organizing groups haven't been able to really tell that story or have the data to show it in a way that youth development funders want to hear it. Many youth organizers were very good at talking about our campaigns, and we walk in and we talk to a funder and we tell the story of our campaign and the things that we're working on. But for youth development funders, that's not always the thing that they want to hear about. They want to hear about the process that young people go through. And we often are so focused on the campaigns that we're not as effective in talking about that. Next slide, please. So the other thing that FCYO did is that we did a bunch of research on youth organizing. And Carolyn, who you'll hear from a little bit later, will tell you more about this. But last year, FCYO engaged in a research process where we interviewed a lot of funders. We were trying to identify who are the funders that aren't currently funding youth organizing, but that could, and what messages would actually work to reach them. And so Carolyn and Movement Strategy Center and Wonder Strategies for Good were part of this research team. And they really tried to identify who are the funders, what would it take to reach them, are they receptive to this, how can we best reach them? And you can see a link here to the webinar that we did, and it's on our website as well if you want to really see what came out of that research. But essentially the question that we're asking with this project is, if we really give youth organizing groups a deep understanding in these tools to reach these funders, the messages that are likely to reach them, the best tools for evaluating the impacts on young people, and an understanding of the language that these funders speak, can we actually open up the doors of a new source of funding to really support the important work that you all are doing on the ground? How can we best support you all to be able to go out and reach this vast source of funders that's often hard to reach for youth organizing groups? We think it's possible, and we think there are some tools that can be helpful to do it. Next slide. So, hold on one second while we just get to the next slide. Sorry, we may have a slight delay in advancing the slide. Sorry about that.
I'm seeing goals, Eric. This is Will, and you froze for a minute.
Oh, okay.
You froze for a minute.
Maybe
Eric,
a delay on my end.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Sometimes the internet is slow to catch up.
Thanks, Samantha. It seems like folks are seeing goals also, the participants.
Good. I'm seeing it now too. I think it just caught a second. So, so basically, there are two major goals for this project. The first is to assist youth organizing groups in understanding, strengthening, and measuring how you support young people's social and emotional, academic, and basic needs while you organize. Right? So really understanding, strengthening, measuring, how do you already do that work, right? And how does that connect to some of the language around the research? Second goal, how do we support the capacity of youth organizing groups to be able to use that to reach new sets of funders that aren't necessarily those funders that already are deeply committed to social justice and organizing, but are more committed to the impacts on young people, which is a far larger source of funding than those funders that are already deeply committed to organizing and social justice. Next slide. So the project has a couple of main components. First, we will be selecting a cohort of 8 to 10 groups. Each of the selected organizations will pick 2 organizational leaders to participate in all of the activities. We'd like for one of those people those should be people that are deeply involved in both the fundraising and in the youth organizing program. So preferably an executive director or the head of the youth organizing program, another staff person who's involved again. We want to make sure there's people who are involved in both the fundraising components and in the supports for young people and the evaluation components. So select 2 organizational leaders to participate. The project will start with an initial assessment where we'll just want to understand, what are you already doing? What are your strengths? What are the areas that you want to improve? From there, there'll be a 2-day kickoff training. The dates for that are already set. It will be June 5 and 6. We're still picking the location. FCYO will cover the costs of travel and room and board for all the participants. So there'll be a 2-day kickoff training. After that, there'll be 8 webinars over the course of a year that will offer web-based trainings on a bunch of the different skills that we'll be offering. There also will be an online evaluation tool that will provide access to, and we'll tell you more about this in a minute, that your groups will be able to use, an easy tool to evaluate the impact that your program is having on individual young people. In addition to that, you'll get 12 to 15 hours of one-on-one coaching on a fundraising plan to really help you figure out how to use all of this to figure out who are the new funders that you want to reach and what do you need in order to reach them. And lastly, in the past, our capacity building programs have not had grant dollars. The last capacity buildings that we were done were just training. There was no funding. But fortunately, we have a little bit more funding now, and this is a little bit more of an intensive project, so we are able to offer participants a $10,000 stipend. It was really what it is. So we know this isn't a lot of a big grant opportunity. If what you're looking at for is funding for your organization, this really isn't that. This is just a small grant to be able to compensate your time for participating in this initiative. Next slide, please. So there's really 2 parts to this project. again, that relate to the first goals. The first part, again, is really about understanding, strengthening, and assessing youth supports. And under that will be first assessing how are you already supporting youth leaders in your organization. We know that you're already doing a lot of this work. So we'll try to help your groups assess that, make clear what you're already doing to support that. And maybe through that, there'll be some areas of that you'll want to strengthen. Maybe you'll learn from some of the other groups in the cohort how they're doing that and want to incorporate some of those practices. Second, there'll be an opportunity to connect the practices that you're already doing to the research on youth development and social and emotional learning. So how does what you're already doing in your youth organizing program relate to the research and the language of youth development and social and emotional learning? We want to be able to connect that. Then you'll get some support to develop an individual theory of change. So to actually take that process that young people go through and develop that into the kind of a theory of change that could be shared with funders to explain how young people really benefit from participation in your organization based on the practices that you do. And then lastly, as I said, you'll get access to this online evaluation tool that will help you do an evaluation with your young people. And Kim will tell you a little bit more about that in a few minutes. And we will provide access to that tool for 2 years. So you'll still have access to a tool, for the year that we do the project and for a year afterwards. Next slide. So the second part of the project is about reaching new funders and building the fundraising capacities of the group. And in this part of the project, you'll be learning from the research that FCYO did on funding and messaging, really incorporating some of those tools and research into your work. We'll have a bunch of opportunities to learn from funders and from youth organizers. So to hear directly from funders about what they think youth organizing groups need to do to be able to reach them, and to hear from some youth organizers that have been successful in doing this. And then there'll be some direct coaching around developing a fundraising plan to be able to reach some new funders. Next slide, please. So at this point now, I want to introduce you to the team that will be providing the capacity building support. This is something, again, that FCYO has been talking about for a long time. And so we took our time and really tried to do a lot of research to find the folks that we thought really understood this and really could offer something to youth organizing groups that would be new and different and really help build the capacity to do this. So we're very excited to introduce this technical assistance team. So first, I want to introduce Kim Sabo-Flores from Algorithm. Kim has a long history of supporting youth organizing groups and youth development groups around capacity building and around evaluation. She's worked with the Cricket Island Foundation, the Bound Foundation, a lot of other projects. And she will be specifically supporting groups around the research and understanding the research around youth development and social and emotional learning and around evaluation capacity. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kim to introduce herself a little bit more and say more about how she's going to be supporting groups as part of this project.
Thanks, Derek. And it's great. I think, as we've laid out the flow and we'll share this, it sounds like this very distinct piece that I'm doing and a very distinct piece that Carolyn's doing, but really the goal that we have is to really work in concert together. So while I'm going to lay out the pieces that directly support evaluation that I'll be working directly with you on, really you'll see within kind of the flow of the next year that Carolyn and I will kind of be in and out of your lives in different ways. And so think about this as very connected, but I'm going to present it almost as if I'm operating separately from Carolyn, knowing very much that as we think about evaluation and how to support you to understand the research that's underpinning your work, that's really going to work hand in glove with what Carolyn's doing with you. It's going to focus on how you're going to use those data and message points to share with funders for your fundraising strategy. So just to tee that up. But as a way of introduction, yes, I've been doing work in evaluation, participatory evaluation in particular, in the space of youth organizing, youth-led social change for a lot of years. So So really excited to get started on this project. We've been talking about it for a long time. I'm deeply passionate about the social emotional learning outcomes that I'm going to talk to you about in a little bit, because I think that they're such a wonderful new way of thinking about some of our work, and it is I would be absolutely shocked if youth organizing programs are not moving the needle on some of these social emotional learning outcomes, because our work is so deeply invested in supporting young people in all of the ways that we need to support young people as we move into organizing work. So I'm super excited to see what we learn together. So this is the basic outline. I'm going to kind of click through it. But the first thing we're going to do during our 2-day in-person retreat is really to dig into what we now know about social emotional learning and positive youth development, and start to explore together how what we know from research, how you all are already doing that. I am sure that you're already doing it. It's a matter of lifting up those practices that you're already doing, and the outcomes that you're already thinking about, and kind of helping to weave that together with the language that the research has been discussing and sharing, so that we can begin to articulate our work and using some of these frameworks. You can go ahead and click to the next slide, Will. So this first, I'm going to show you a little bit about why I think social emotional learning is such an awesome opportunity. A lot of the long-term outcomes and impacts that funders, especially youth development funders, tend to be asking for, and frankly, youth development programs are bad at delivering them as well, have to do with long-term outcomes. And will you just click that first? Yeah, tell the first, yeah. So a lot of the long-term outcomes that youth development funders are typically asking for tend to fall into kind of academic performance, college readiness, workforce readiness, reduced risk, kind of increased positive behaviors, and increased thriving. And so a lot of times, and even in youth development, those long-term outcomes are the kinds of things that funders tend to ask for, and that frankly most organizations, including youth development organizations, cannot possibly measure or deliver upon, because there are long-term outcomes and there's a lot of things influencing those outcomes. And so one of the reasons that I'm excited about social emotional learning outcomes in particular is that those are the kinds of outcomes that really focus on an entire young person's development. And we know through research tend to move the needle on longer term outcomes. So more and more in youth development, people are looking towards social emotional outcomes because we're using them as a proxy measure. In other words, saying if we're moving the needle on the social emotional outcomes, it's very likely that these long-term gains that funders are often asking for are also happening because the research is connecting them together. And so the ones we're going to be looking at are about contribution, social skills, self-management, which is about a young person's ability to manage themselves through a project or a campaign, social capital, which is really about the adults in a young person's life, or even the other peers in their lives that are supporting them to accomplish the kinds of goals and dreams that they have in their lives, a sense of positive identity, and then academic self-efficacy. And there, it's not necessarily about how youth are doing academically, rather about their confidence to be able to pursue academics. One thing I'm excited about in our most recent studies that we've been doing, contribution is a key predictor to everything else. And so the reason I'm excited about the work and looking specifically at youth organizing is that I'm certain that in youth organizing, because you start with a contributional lens, you start with a lens of supporting young people to engage in things that are meaningful to them and taking action on things that are meaningful to them. And so I am certain that you're driving up contribution, and if you're driving up contribution, you're also driving up the other social emotional skills. So I'm super excited to explore that with you all. The other thing we know, and you can just click to the next, maybe 2 clicks, Will. The other thing we like to look at is, so we know that these outcomes lead to these longer term gains, but what are the practices that are really driving the social emotional learning outcomes? And those tend to also, I think you're going to find that they map over beautifully to a lot of the youth organizing work, right? They're really about engaging young people in meaningful decisions, really engaging them in things that they're interested in, things that are meaningful in their life, supporting them to make real decisions, developing a positive youth-adult relationship, right? They're about engaging peers together and learning, and developing projects together, taking risks, and reflecting. They're about goal management, which is really about setting forward goals, whether or not they're specific or not. But if you're engaged in project-related work, which most of us are, right? Those are the goals that we have toward our campaigns, toward our organizing work. And then really supportive staff who are able to continue to grow and evolve alongside young people. So we know that those practices are driving up these outcomes, and these outcomes are driving up those long-term gains. So we're really going to work together to explore how that looks in your organizations and help you take the research that we know ties all these pieces together and map it into your own theory of change that makes sense given how you're doing these things and how they look in your organization. You can click to the next slide, Will. So that's where we'll spend some one-to-one time really creating logic models that are based on that research, and those will be kind of super tailored to your work and calling out how those various practices and outcomes play out in the work you're doing. And then we're going to launch a study. We're going to launch a strong evaluation study. And we're going to use what we have as a youth development impact learning system that we've created. And we'll be able to launch a study using an online platform where young people will take a survey, and staff will take a survey. They're about 15 to 20 minutes long. They'll take a survey on their phone or on their laptop or even on paper. And then you can just keep clicking through that. And then immediately after they've taken the pre-survey, they'll kind of click through that, and then it will, you can keep clicking, Will. And then as soon as they're done with taking the survey, you'll have an immediate online report that will tell you how young people are scoring, where their strengths are, where their challenges are, and what kinds of practices that you could be delivering to them that would help drive up their scores, right? So it's immediate findings available to you. And as soon as you've done that pre-work, we'll meet together in a webinar and we'll talk about what are we finding, what are we seeing, what are we learning about the youth that we're serving in terms of their social emotional outcomes, and what can we better do to serve them, right? And then, so we'll launch that study in about October, right? In the meantime, you'll be doing some work with Carolyn around weaving those practices and outcomes into your communication strategies with funders. You can go ahead and click forward. I think I already said this, Will. And then we can, again, I think I said we'll make meeting of the data. Then in about May, at the end of the academic year, or depending on, we'll also work to see what makes sense given what your program cycles are, when to do a post. But many of you will want to do a post in May. Some of you may have a post that you want to do in January, but we'll work to figure out what makes the most sense. Then you'll launch the system again and conduct a post survey. You can just click through that, kind of just little illustration of how it works at post. It looks kind of the same. And then as soon as the young people are finished with the survey, you can go right into your online platform and it will tell you how many young people have made statistically significant increases in each of the outcome areas. And then and we ask young people in the surveys what they're experiencing in the program. So what practices that are they experiencing in the program, and what kinds of things could the staff could be doing better, because staff may be thinking that they're delivering a certain kind of experience, but youth aren't feeling that way. So we'll have a post making meaning session after everybody launched their post surveys. We'll do some really deep thinking about what we've learned together. Will, you can kind of click to the next slide. And really there, we're going to be talking about what are we learning about young people and how social emotional learning plays out in our youth organizing practices. What do we learn? What's missing? What other measures might we want to use besides this, right? And how might we capture additional data, right? So this tool is one thing that's going to be helping us measure those practices and those outcomes, but there might be other measures that we think are super important that would help to continue to tell that story. And we'll be exploring those together as well. So that's kind of what the evaluation section will look like. And I can turn it over to Carolyn to start talking about how she's going to weave that into communication strategies with funders.
Great. So thank you, Kim. So that's really helpful. And thanks for pointing out, right, that these really aren't two separate and parts of the project, but that we will work, that Kim and Carolyn will be working closely together and with support from FCYO to try to make this more of a unified kind of project, which I think is a really important point about this. So the other person who will be working on this team is Carolyn Laub, and Carolyn was one of the primary researchers on the youth organizing research that FCYO did last year. So she got the chance to do a lot of interviews and has a lot of expertise on that. She's also was one of the founders of the Gay Straight Alliance Network, so has a long history in youth organizing herself, and has been working as a consultant around communications and fundraising and a number of other things for a few years. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Carolyn.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks, Kim, for setting up just a great sequence for what we're going to be doing on the evaluation side. So I wanted to, GSA Network I come out of youth organizing. GSA Network is now the Genders and Sexualities Alliance Network, also has had a name change since I founded it and was running it. And while I was doing that work, we really endeavored to raise a lot of money from foundations. And so when I started working as a consultant a few years ago, I definitely have continued. Part of my practice has been to support other groups around their fundraising strategies. What I was particularly excited about, one of the best things I've worked on as a consultant is I'm a strategist with Wonder Strategies for Good, which does strategic communications work. And we partnered up with the Movement Strategy Center over a year ago to work with FCYO to do this research project that Eric mentioned, where we were interviewing funders primarily to identify who are the funders that would be interested and potentially willing to support youth organizing. But there's some barrier, there's some reasons or set of reasons why they're reluctant to fund youth organizing, or they haven't yet done it. And so we learned a tremendous amount from that project and have made a set of recommendations, both for how FCYO can talk to funders, how other funders that are already supporting youth organizing can invest in supporting, get their peers to invest in supporting youth organizing, and how youth organizing groups can talk to funders that they haven't yet talked to or haven't yet convinced to support their work. So it's a combination really of the two things that we will be doing in this project that this entire cohort is designed around. One is the data, how to make sure that the story you're telling about what outcomes you're generating through your youth organizing is talking about both the campaign outcomes and the policy and structural changes that you're making, as well as the impacts on the individual young people. And that was something I know at GSA Network we did a lot, was talk to funders about both the outcomes of our work from a policy standpoint, or in terms of the cultural change that we are creating in schools. And we talked about the impacts on individual young people and their leadership skills and things like that. So this is going to bring together, an opportunity to bring together the data, as well as the language and the messages and the ways specifically to talk about youth organizing with funders that aren't yet maybe sold on the idea of youth organizing, or they've got some sort of mental template in their mind of what youth organizing is and don't really appreciate or fully understand all of the complexity of what you're doing in your youth organizing work. So what I want to do is today give you, I'm not going to walk through an outline of exactly kind of how the details of how we would work together over the course of the year. It's essentially going to parallel what Kim already talked about with you, which is a 2-day kickoff, some additional webinars at key points along the year, and where you'll hear from other funders as well as from peers about who have been successfully reaching youth development funders or community foundations interested in youth development in their community or in your community. And then I'll do some coaching and technical assistance for you to really develop a fundraising plan to help you figure out how are you going to expand the foundations that you're reaching? How are you going to communicate with them? How are you going to incorporate what you're learning from the online evaluation that Kim's walking you through. How are you going to incorporate that into grant proposals or into site visits or into the communication that you have with funders? How are you going to do better prospecting to find the funders that would be open to funding you? So what I wanted to do today is just give you a taste of what we learned from the research that we did last year with FCYO. So, and you can look at the whole thing online, as Eric, I think, has already included the link in the chat. But I wanted you to just get a taste of it so you can sort of see what are the kinds of things we would be exploring that could help you in your foundation fundraising work. So you go to the next slide. This is a summary of what Wonder Strategies for Good and Movement Strategy Center found when we did our research a year ago. And I think there was a preview of some of these findings that you may have seen earlier. I'm going to go over them briefly. We found there are common characteristics of audiences who can be persuaded to fund youth organizing strategies, and there's also some that can't be persuaded to fund youth organizing strategies. And so we'll go into, in the 2-day kickoff retreat, we will go over that in great detail so that you're not wasting your time trying to reach funders that really can't be persuaded, and that you're going to learn how to, when you're prospecting and considering possible funders, like how do you even start through conversations with program officers, or even just in reviewing their websites, how can you figure out who's a good bet? Secondly, we tested some messaging, and I'm going to show you an excerpt of something that we tested in just a minute. And we tested the messaging both with youth organizers and with funders, and found that it was there were some things that were very persuasive and very helpful, and things that youth organizers that we tested it with would be very excited to use or are already using successfully. But what we found was that there was really a need to do further training on implementation. That's in part what led to this project. And then the last thing that is the numbers 5 and 6 here in terms of the findings from our research, the messages and the stories that you tell as a youth organizer to funders that are the target audience, the youth development funders or community foundations, those who have not already become convinced that youth organizing is something important for them to fund, there are very specific ways to do that work, to tell the stories about what you're doing, and to be emotionally attuned to what those audiences care about. So we'll get to that in just a minute. We'll go to the next slide. So just to give you a taste of what we did learn about the funders who can be persuaded, if you look first at this chart down at the bottom, this flow this is a sort of a shorthand way of thinking about how funders, a framework for how different funders might think about young people. So prior to really the field of youth development, many funders and many adults think about young people having problems, having deficits, and the shift toward youth development really began to see young people as having assets. So not that young people have problems that need to be solved by adults, but really that young people themselves have assets that can be tapped into in order to solve problems in their own lives and to improve their own lives. Increasingly in the last decade or more, there's been a shift for many funders to start to see not just that young people have assets, but that they have a voice, and they actually that voice needs to be heard in shaping their own lives and their communities and their schools, so that those voices need to be lifted up. And then I would say, in terms of the spectrum where youth organizing lies, is generally on the farther end of the spectrum, to really be invested in developing the power of young people to actually change the conditions and circumstances and structures around them. So it really is a different approach than just seeing young people individually as having assets, but really collectively having power and needing to have power in order to change their schools, their communities, and the structures around them. So this is a very sort of quick way of describing kind of like being able to figure out where funders lie on the spectrum will help you figure out which of the funders that would be likely to be persuaded to support youth organizing, even if they do not yet see young people as having power or needing to have the kind of power that we do in collective organizing and in community organizing. The other thing I'll just say is that there's generally, we found that funders that have some diversity already in their investment portfolio, meaning like among their grantees, they are funding multiple kinds of strategies, multiple different types of groups. They are more inclined to then think about adding youth organizing groups into their portfolio, as opposed to a funder that is narrowly focused only on, let's say, after-school programs that are improving literacy. That's probably not likely to be a funder that, even if they share the viewpoint or framework about young people, they're not likely to be a funder that's going to then start adding a youth organizing group into their portfolio. So if you go to the next slide. An additional finding that we found in our research is that to be persuaded to fund youth organizing, you first have to find the right targets, and think about it maybe as an organizing campaign, essentially, like who are your targets? And then what are the messages that are going to be persuasive to those targets? And it turns out what we found is that funders really need to hear directly from young people in addition to hearing from other peers. So it's very persuasive for funders to hear from other funders, and we can think about strategies for you to engage some of your current champions and program officers that believe in what you're doing. They hold relationships with funders, so that's part of the mapping that we'll do in developing your fundraising plan. How can you engage them to speak on your behalf? And we also want to help you tell the stories and create the communication tools and the funding proposals and grant proposals where funders can hear directly from young people about the kinds of stories about the work that you're doing. So this, in the orange box here, you can see this is like a sample story that we created and tested. A headline, how 30 young people improved educational opportunities for 300,000 students. And this is a fictionalized story, but we can actually look at your own stories of your work and craft these kinds of newsletter articles or communication tools, case studies about your work that you can begin to incorporate in the communication that you share. There's specific things that we learned about why this particular story works. So the youth perspective is very important. There's personal details that make the story authentic to funders. That is very important. Funders appreciated seeing the role of adults. They want to understand how adults play a role in working with young people. So and that's the case for many of your organizations, that adults do play important roles. So being clear about that is important to funders who otherwise are perhaps skeptical about what young people can do on their own. So so that's important to sort of just tell that story in a nuanced way. And they are very excited. The funders really have an appetite for more detail about how specifically can both a youth organizing program impact the individual outcomes for young people. And this story, actually, at the end of the story, I'm showing you an excerpt, but at the end of the story, the impact on Louise specifically gets shared in the story. But then also how young people, a small number of young people, can create larger structural change or policy impacts for a huge number of people. That can be very compelling to youth development funders. But they want to know, like, they believe that the policymaking process or the process of creating that kind of structural change is actually very messy and long. It takes a long time. And so how you tell that story in a way that really is authentic to funders based on what they think it takes to change policy is an important learning from our research. You go to the next slide. I mentioned earlier that the messages need to be emotionally attuned to the target audience. What does that mean, really? This is actually what Wonder Strategies for Good is particularly focused on, is emotional attunement of messaging and strategic communications. A couple key points here, we learned that you really have to lead with the outcomes that funders are looking to accomplish. So most of us come into the room or set out to write a proposal about our youth organizing, and we want to talk all about youth organizing, and we're going to explain to you how it works and what we do and what our campaign stories are and our victories from our campaigns or what we're trying to accomplish right now. And that's not the framework, that's not connecting with the funders around the things that they currently care about. So starting with what they care about doesn't mean that you leave behind any discussion about your youth organizing, but you are going to create better connections if you lead first with the outcomes that funders care about. So in the case of youth development funders, those are typically the individual outcomes on the individual young people. So the research that you'll do in this project with Kim we will then figure out how to incorporate that into your messaging so that you're still sharing your authentic story about your youth organizing, but you're connecting with the outcomes that funders care about first. There are also many misconceptions about the term youth organizing. So starting with that term as opposed to something like young people working together to improve their community, which might sound like not the language you're used to using, but it's really about translating what you're doing, translating it, using the messages and the language that youth development funders are using to help get them interested in what you're doing. And then you're taking them on a journey and helping them understand that the way in which you're doing it is through a unique methodology of youth organizing. And that then you get this 2-for-1 investment, this 2-for-1 return on the investment. And I know that language of return on investment is not something that a lot of youth organizers are really comfortable with. And we'll talk about that and we'll explore that in this process. Like, how do you actually speak with and do some code switching with funders that may use a particular language that you're not as comfortable with? But how do you communicate still nonetheless the incredible impact of the work that you're doing, not just on youth individually, but also on the outcomes that you're creating in terms of your campaign victories. So we'll talk about the systemic change and the individual changes, the 2-for-1 investment. And then next slide. So I'm going to turn it back over to Eric to talk about the criteria. I'm really looking forward to reading everyone's, seeing your applications and working with all of you over the next year.
Great. Thank you, Carolyn. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the criteria. I see that we have about 93 folks on this webinar. We are going to be selecting a cohort of 8 to 10 groups. Wish that we had resources to work with a larger number of groups. What that means, let me just say first off, is that we will, and we know from our past experience, we will get more good proposals than we can support. And in some ways, we'll look for diversity of issue, region, things like that, and we just won't be able to support all of the really good organizations. And that's why but we will share the tools and lessons that we learned from this with the field as a whole. So I just wanted to be clear about that from the beginning. Within that, though, then how will we choose the groups that we're going to work with? So one, we said that we want to work with well-established youth organizing groups. So this is not intended for new organizations. Because we want to work with groups that, one, already have a track record for organizing strong campaigns, already are really engaging young people in addressing root causes of systemic inequity in their communities and have already shown some ability to have success and impact in doing that. Two, we want to work with groups that already have a strong intentional leadership development program. That you're working with at least 30 to 40 youth leaders who are active on a regular basis. So not for organizations. So in order to be able to demonstrate the outcomes, it's not for groups that may still be very small, have very small numbers of core youth leaders, and that already have some intentionality to the ways that you support youth leaders, both in developing leadership skills, but we want groups that have already thought some about how are we supporting the holistic needs of our members. So this is not intended for groups that may be brand new to even thinking about that. So you've already thought some about, this is how we might support the academic needs, or this is how we might support the social and emotional needs of our members. There's not a need that you're already doing formal evaluation of that, but that you've already put some that you're not just organizing campaigns, but have really thought some already about how are we supporting the holistic needs of our youth leaders. So again, this is not intended to be for groups that are brand new to organizing. It should be for groups that, we know that there are many groups that are doing youth development and are starting to move towards organizing. This is intended for groups that already are solidly organizing groups and already have a track record for running campaigns and for building and supporting the leadership of young people and want to take that to the next level to reach new funders. So that's the intention about who we're trying to reach with that. I'll also say that it's really important that the groups that do this have the ability and desire to strengthen those supports for young people. Some organizing groups really just want to focus on organizing. We want to go out and lead campaigns. We want to be on the front lines of social justice. We're not really interested in really thinking about how do we support the academic, social, and emotional needs of our members. If that's where you're at, this is not the right project for you. This is for groups that really do want to think about, we do want to be on the front lines of social justice, and we want to think about how be more intentional about how we support the needs of our members, and we want to evaluate it. Some of you might feel like, we don't really want to evaluate. We're not interested in that. If you're not interested in doing evaluation, again, this probably isn't the right project for you. And also, this is for people that want to develop new messages for funders, right? Some people, that we know there are some of you out there that want to lead all the time with your most radical politics, right? Many of us feel, we should never soften that up for any audience. But as Carolyn said, some of the lessons about this will be about how do you talk to different kinds of funders and how do you reach them, and that will mean being creative and flexible in segmenting messages for different audiences and using messages that are likely to be emotionally attuned to different audiences. If you're somebody that says, I never want to soften my politics for anybody, if that's where you're at, this might not be the right project for you. Again, so this is for people that want to engage in being creative about how to reach a larger base of funders and how to be more intentional about supporting and evaluating. And we know that's not every group, and that's fine. There are other projects that FCYO is doing that are around power building, and those might be a better match for you. But this is for folks that really want to figure out how to reach these youth development funders, and that's not everybody in the world of youth organizing, and that's okay. There should be diversity in how we're doing this, but want to be clear that we're looking for groups that that are solidly doing youth organizing, but that want to be creative about how to reach new kinds of funders and how to message and how to evaluate what they're doing. Again, also, we want people that have the ability and desire to participate. We listed all of the activities that we're going to be doing. You have to be able to make the time commitment to have 2 core organizational leaders that have the time commitment to participate in that. And lastly, as we said, we want you to have 2 full-time equivalent staff members. So our experience is that organizations that only have 1 staff, only have a half-time person, just don't have the time to be able to participate in this kind of an activity and really benefit from it. So we need groups that at least are sort of stable enough and that they have the equivalent of 2 full-time staff people. Again, for very small organizations, this may not be the right match. So that's a little bit about the criteria. Next slide, please. Briefly, just the application process. You'll see the first step, and some of you have already done this. The first step in any FCYO application is our online map. I want to again mention that online map is really helpful for us at FCYO and really helpful for sharing your work with other funders. If you've already applied to an FCYO program, all you need to do is update it. I know there have been some tech problems with it in the past, but it seems to be working very well now. If you have questions about it, you can reach out to Will. So the first step will be just to complete, if you haven't done it before, or if you already have, to update the profile on the map. And then there's a cover page, a short narrative, and a couple of attachments. We're asking that you send that through the secure Dropbox link. That is partly to increase the security of your data and your files and your financial information and all of that. If you have any questions about that, you can reach out to Will. Next slide, please. I listed here the questions that are for the narrative, but really, again, I won't go through them right now because they're in the RFP, and I know we're running a little bit late, but just so that you know, those are the questions. But what we're going to be looking for is, again, groups that really have the interest and desire. That's a lot of what we're going to be looking for. Who knows what they want to get out of this and has been thinking about these questions already. So I think what will be important is to demonstrate, what have you already done that you already are a strong youth organizing group? And how have you already been thinking about these questions, about reaching new kinds of funders, about how you support the development of youth leaders, and what's next for you? Where are you trying to take that? And the groups that I think are going to be most successful are the groups that can be really clear about what you want to get out of this. Because that's what we want, is a set of groups that are really committed and really interested in this. Next slide. That was a lot of talking. We gave you a lot of information. So we will stay on. I know I can stay on for a little bit longer to answer any questions you have. So the best way to ask questions is to put them in the Q&A tab. We'll try to get to ones that I saw that came up in the chat, but if you can put them in the Q&A tab, that's an easier way for us to get to them. So let me see. There was a question, Kim. I think you spoke to it in the chat about that was, I think, addressed to you, Kim, about the tool. Do you want to just speak to that briefly?
Sure. It seems to have come up here as well again, right? So we're going to be using something called the Youth Development Impact Learning System. It's a mouthful, but you know, that is available to anybody who wants it, who wants to participate in it. It's a low-cost online evaluation tool that delivers pre-post measures and analysis of the kinds of things that I talked about earlier. So if you're, you know, if you're interested in that beyond this program, and we hope also that, you know, folks are using it during this, right? That's why we give them a 2-year subscription. It's an annual subscription fee. It's very low cost. For most organizations are paying about $500 a year for it. Some, I think the starting is $375. So anyway, it's available to anybody who wants to engage in that online platform at a low subscription rate. So happy to share that with you if that's something that you want to know more about it as well.
Great. Thank you. There's a question here about what do we mean when we say 2 full-time staff. You know, I think basically what we're saying, you know, we want there to be 2 staff people that are working on your youth organizing program, 2 full-time staff people or the equivalent somehow. So again, this is not for very small organizations, but for organizations that are working with, you know, at least 30 to 40 core young people, and that have 2 staff people. And that's just been our experience, that for capacity building programs like this, for groups that only have 1 staff person or something like that, it just isn't the time to often really even be able to benefit from something as intensive as what we're offering here. Let's see, I think Kim, keep coming if there's any other questions in the Q&A, if there's anything else we can be more clear about.
Eric, do you want to answer the question about restrictions on the $10,000?
Oh, thank you. I missed that. There's no restrictions on the $10,000. Basically, that's a small way to contribute for your time for participating in the project. This is going to be a demanding project, and we wanted to be able to offer something for your time. We don't think of it as a large grant. It doesn't do much more than compensate you for the time that you're using to participate in this project. So with that said, then there's no stipulations on how you use that funding.
Eric, there's a question about, do all the youth have to be in the same program? And I'm not sure if you want to say more about that. You know, what you were thinking there. And Eric, unless you know what the question is, I wasn't sure about that meant.
Yeah. I don't know exactly what that question is referring to, and you can follow up with us. You know, feel free after this to send me emails. You'll see my email is in the chat there. It's eric@fcyo.org, and you can feel free to ask me more individual questions. In general, you know, we want there to be, you know, 30 to 40 young people that are involved in your youth organizing work. You tell us what that means, you know. Just looking through the questions here. Is online youth organizing something to consider for local to national organizing of youth? I mean, there's fabulous work that people are doing around online organizing. We think that's great. That's probably, you know, we think there needs to be a local core of young people for this project. So what we're doing, you know, what we're doing here is going to be important to have face-to-face contact with young people. Online organizing is really good. It can be a way, in addition to your face-to-face organizing, to make a case to funders about scale, right? You know, we reach this larger base through our online organizing, but it'll be important that you have face-to-face contact with young people for this project. I see another question here. Let's see, could you please clarify if you consider proposals from orgs that are primarily service providers? Unfortunately, we do not. We're not able to do that. FCYO, there's a lot of other funders that focus on funding service organizations. With our limited resource, we focus on groups that are primarily youth organizing groups. That's where we concentrate our limited resources. So for youth organizing groups that are figuring out how to incorporate youth development supports into their work, yes. And we know that there's a lot of service organizations that are starting to incorporate youth organizing into their work. This probably isn't the right project for that. We want to be supportive of that work, but with our limited resources, we're focused on groups that really are primarily organizing groups. And that will be true for this project.
Right. Yeah, I would just add on to that, Eric. This is Will. Eric is right on with that. We do want to know about your work. So that first step in that process, filling out of the FCYO Youth Organizing Landscape Map, is a great way for us to know about your work. Even if you're a primarily service-focused organization that has some youth organizing work, fill it out. Let us know what you're doing so we can learn more about what you do and incorporate it into what we're doing. Thanks.
Another important question here about age group, and I do want to make sure to speak to this. So for this, FCYO historically, our primary focus has always been on young people aged 13 to 18. Now, we've started to expand that definition. For many of our projects, we are interested in organizations that are supporting, young adults, 18 to 25-year-olds in organizing work. But for this work, because we're really talking about youth development outcomes and reaching youth development funders, we are really going to be focused on that 13 to 18 demographic. In reaching out to youth development funders. Now, is there some wiggle room? Can you be involving some of those 18 to 25-year-olds in your work as well? Yes, but for those groups that are primarily focused on like 18 to 25-year-olds, I think that this will not be the right project for those organizations.
There's also a question, Eric, about language and support for young people who are non-English speakers. So for the survey work, and I'm assuming that's one of the major places that would come up, Carolyn, unless there's something that you can think of. But in the survey work, we have the surveys translated in English and Spanish and French. There might also be one other, maybe Indian language. I have to go to look, but if we don't have it translated in that, we'll work to get the translation to you if the young people are having difficulty reading the survey. So hopefully that will work fine. They may not be able to take it online. They may have to take it on paper, but we do have translations available.
Right. Great. Thank you. Another question here. Does that mean that you're looking for a group of 40, specifically 13 to 18? Or can a group of 40 be mixed between youth and young adults? Primarily, we'd be looking for you to have 30 to 40, 13 to 18-year-olds. And we're going to there's a little bit of wiggle room on there. If it's a little bit smaller than that, we're not going to be very strict about that. But if you only have 10 young people in your program, this may not be, this probably is not the right project for you. We know there are some youth organizing groups that their core group of youth leaders is very small, at this point, 8 to 10. We want groups that are, that have a leadership core, of close to 30 young people, I think, to be able to really participate and benefit from this project.
And Eric, I'm sure this is true too, but I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, but certainly if you have, youth who are in that 18 to 21 bracket who may still be in high school because they haven't yet graduated for all the reasons that occurs. I don't think that it's not like there's some dead set cutoff that 18 and out kind of thing. So
No, that's absolutely true. For groups that primarily work with, say, campus-based organizing, this is probably not. Right. This is probably not the right project for that. But yes, if those young people, right, if some of those young people are slightly higher, especially for people working with out of school youth, stuff like that, up to 21, we're not going to be super strict about a direct cutoff like that. Yes. Any other questions that people have? We're speaking a bunch about the numbers, and there was an interesting question that somebody asked early about scale. And the scale question, I think, is a really, it is often one of the challenges in reaching youth development funders. And there are some youth development funders that we're never going to reach on that. They're only going to fund organizations that, serve 1,000 young people. And those, again, as Carolyn talked about, we look at this, we look at that spectrum and we look at who is reachable. But we believe there are a set of funders that are really reachable, that don't care as much about that scale. Again, that's why we do want people to have a leadership core of around 30 young people or more, that you have some level of scale. We also think there's interesting ways to talk about how you engage, who is the base that is involved in your actions, that isn't participating regularly, and how do they benefit from your programs in order to address questions of scale. I think that's a really, and we will talk about that in this cohort. How do we address the concerns of some of these funders that we have a certain level of scale? And
just to put a fine point on that, that is actually the reason that we test this question of scale, is why we tested this hypothetical or fictionalized story about a group of 30 young people changing the academic possibilities for 300,000 students by changing a policy in one school district. And so you can speak to both, to scale, both by talking about how, by talking about the base, your base, and what Eric's saying, like you might have 30 core leaders, but they also engage, even more young people in their community. And you can talk about scale in terms of changing the outcomes from a policy standpoint for a much larger number of young people, like changing, a job readiness or a jobs program in your city that then becomes available to, 100,000 young people, or changing a school policy. Those are the kinds of things that we tested very well with youth development funders who have expressed some interest in impacting larger systemic changes. And that's the kind of thing that we'll be studying and helping you do.
Right. So I think we've answered most of the questions. If there's any last questions, put them in now, or feel free to send them to me later. Again, it's eric@fcyo.org. It's in the chat there. So feel free to send me any specific questions that you have, if there's anything that we didn't get to, or put any last questions that you have now. Let me just ask Carolyn and Kim, is there anything else that you want to make sure to add before we go?
Nope, that's it. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming.
Again,
thank you.
Yes, well, thanks everybody for making this time to be here. Happy to answer any more additional questions that you have. And again, we know that we won't be able to support every organization through this project, but know that at FCYO, part of why we do this is to develop some tools and lessons that we can then share with the field as a whole, and we're really committed to doing that. We know that there's more good work out there than we're able to directly support. We're trying to raise more money so that we can include more groups in these things, and we'll keep working on that, but we will definitely be sharing the lessons from this with lots of other organizations, and check out the tools that we shared on this webinar too, if you're not already familiar with them. We'd love to, there's a lot of really useful tools that already exist if you're not familiar with them. So thanks a lot. Again, feel free to follow up with any additional questions, and if not, we'll look forward to seeing proposals and look forward to hearing about all of the really important work that you all are doing. Take care, everybody.
Bye.